Okay, the floor is open. This is Q&A.
So, I met a person, and they're attacking me on my religious beliefs, and they're saying how we call the Haggadah in Hebrew the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and they say the joke is it's the Haggadah, it's a legend, it's a myth, and I felt it was pretty hurtful calling Yetzias Mitzrayim just a myth. It was saying splitting seas, it's things that we don't see today. How does one respond and show how Yetzias Mitzrayim, even a lot of the events are supernatural, how does one it's still logical for those events to have happened even though they are supernatural and we don't really see it today?
Well, I guess I would start sort of backwards. What's the alternative point of view? That we're not going to allow anything supernatural. We're going to rule it out. Any reports of events that are supernatural, we're not going to allow them, we're not going to take them seriously, we're not going to investigate them. The very fact that it's supernatural disqualifies them, invalidates them. So one thing would be good to consider is, what would have happened if people took that attitude 500 years ago? Now, when they said supernatural 500 years ago, that meant violates the nature that we believe in 500 years ago. That's the only nature they knew. That's the only nature they had. They had the nature that they understood 500 years ago. And we're not tolerating anything that violates that, because we don't believe in things that are supernatural. Could they ever have learned that their picture of nature is wrong, capital W? Because it's wrong, capital W. If they're not going to hear something that violates their picture of nature, they're never going to make progress. You can't take a position that my picture of nature is final, finished, perfect. But if you're not prepared to hear something that violates your picture of nature, then you condemn yourself to never making any progress. That doesn't seem to be a reasonable position. Now, what do we think about our picture of nature today? Have we finally finished it? Okay, 500 years ago they were so inexperienced. They didn't have our instrumentation. They didn't have our fancy theories. But today, we've got it. Now we've really got it. Really? Really? Well, I would just remind such a person about a few loose ends. There's something called dark matter and something called dark energy. They're called dark because we don't understand them at all. Dark matter and dark energy together make up 95% of the universe. 95% of the universe we don't understand at all. Is that picture really finished? Final? Not going to change? And what about the fact that quantum mechanics and relativity, which are the two best theories we have, conflict with one another? Something's got to give. Something's got to change, and scientists know that. Something's wrong. Well, then the picture we have has to be changed. It can't be final. Well, so now you're telling me that you don't believe in anything supernatural? If you mean against today's picture of nature, so what? Today's picture is not going to stand. It's not going to last. It's going to change. What else can you tell me? I don't believe in anything that violates the ultimate picture of nature we'll someday have when we know everything. Well, first of all, you have no reason to think that day will ever come. But even if it does come, you don't know today what it's going to look like. So I think someone who's going to take a position against the supernatural on principle, I think he's in a very bad position. A much more reasonable, let me just finish, add one more point. a much more reasonable position would be to say that, and some people have said this, extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. And even though I think that's extraordinarily vague, there is something to it. If you claim that something happened that's out of the ordinary, you'd want more support for it. But then you should ask yourself, how much? You're not going to say, if the claim is really extraordinary, then I'm just not going to consider it, because if that were true, all of 20th century science would never be considered. The claims of 20th century science are very, very extraordinary. What time it is depends upon how fast you're going. Really? And foot rulers change their length at different speeds. Really? And particles aren't there till you look. When you look, they suddenly magically appear there. When they're not there, they're replaced by purple fuzz, something called a probability wave, which is made out of numbers, if a thing could be made out of numbers. This is the story that you're buying today? Well, nobody dreamt of that 120 years ago. So you really don't want to suddenly rule something out on the grounds that it's very, very different and contradicts what you thought you knew. But you want to know how good the evidence has to be, how good the testimony has to be. So I'll give you a parable, which I think illustrates the logic here. Part of the parable is based, it's like a historical novel. Let's imagine 2,000 years ago, someone from Greece visiting China. Say 2,200 years ago, maybe 300 years ago, visiting China. Now, Greece had a very sophisticated culture. Philosophers, scientists, artists, poets. Aristotle was maybe leaving out to question the Jewish people. He may have been the most brilliant man that ever lived. He founded whole new disciplines, whole new sciences, created whole new methodologies, and made remarkable contributions to a tremendous variety of subjects. And Aristotle had a picture of how the world works. The picture was that the heavens are eternal, they always have been, they always will be, and nothing in the heavens changes. Nothing. It's built in such a way that it can't change. Only one kind of matter, and only selected kind of number of forms. It cannot change. That was the Greek picture. Now, that's true. Now let's imagine this Greek goes to visit China. And he's talking to people, and he's talking to the intelligentsia, people who are thinkers. He's very impressed. They're deep thinkers, they're careful thinkers. And he notices they have something in China that they don't have in Greece. As far as I know, they don't even have it anywhere else in the world. They had star charts. They made charts with the positions of the stars in the sky. A lot of dots on the page. You look at the sky, this is a little further apart, a little further apart on the page. Really. They were careful about this. They cared about this. They made star charts. So one night he's got the star chart. He's looking at the sky, comparing. And then he sees it. There's a dot on the page and there's nothing in the sky. So he goes to his friend. He says, there's a mistake in this chart. Because here's the dot and there's nothing in the sky. And his Chinese friend says to him, impossible. Our people don't make mistakes. We're very careful. Show it to me. So I said, look, here it is. Here's the chart. Here's this dot. And I look there in the sky. There's nothing there. He said, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. We don't make mistakes. Then he says, I've got it. Let's check the date of this chart. Oh, he turns it over and he sees that it's signed 30 years ago. And he says, that's the answer. There used to be a star there and it disappeared. At that point, the Greek wants to know, what have you been drinking? What have you been injecting? What have you been sniffing? Stars don't disappear. Stars are always the same. The sky is always the same. Nothing, our greatest philosopher, Aristotle, taught us that nothing in the sky can change. He said, listen, our star charts don't lie. If it had a dot there, and it's 30 years old, it means there was a star there, and it disappeared. Now, as a matter of fact, the ancient Chinese did observe what we would today call a nova explosion, where there was a dot, there was a bright glow for a few months, and then nothing. What is the Greek going to do now? These people are serious people. Of the hundreds of dots on the page, this is the only one he found that isn't accurate. And he talks to people, and they're intelligent people, and they're self-critical people, and they consider alternatives, and so forth and so on. They impress him as well-informed, serious, and bright. And they tell him one of the stars disappeared. I think maybe the Greek could say to himself, look, we live on islands, and maybe we have clouds a lot of the time when there's a clear picture of the sky as you do. We don't have people who make star charts. So obviously we aren't as careful about this as you are. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe our picture of nature is wrong. Our picture of how the world works is wrong. Because you saw something. And if what you saw is correct, then our whole picture is wrong. Notice, this is where people try to get around it. They say, well, you need to have repeated experiments. You have to be able to do something which you can demonstrate for yourself. No, you do not. You cannot make nova explosions in the sky. You cannot do that. All you have to do here is trust their testimony. If they seem to be intelligent people, careful people, critical people, and they say they saw something and you've never seen it, the right thing to do would be to say, well, you've taught me something. I thought it was impossible. I was taught by my thinkers that what you're saying is impossible. But you saw it, so maybe my thinkers are wrong. That's a way in which you could come to revise your picture as to what's going on in the world. Now, I have a whole chapter in my book where I talk about the reliability of testimony and how it's supported. I believe that our testimony, let's say with respect to the revelation of Sinai, is adequate to overcome a person's feeling that we never heard of that happening, so therefore it couldn't have happened. I think we can do that. So there is an extra burden there. I'm prepared to tolerate sort of extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence, though I do think it's very vague. But okay, I think there's something there. I think we can meet that challenge. I wrote a whole book about this, and it's in there in detail. It's called Reason to Believe. So if the person's really serious about it, which I doubt.
The testimony is reliable.
That's right. Certain testimony, not every testimony about every subject, but I created a certain category of testimony and I tested it, and I think that it is extremely reliable. At that point, I think you can use it to correct your otherwise picture of the world and how it has to work. Yeah.
So I wanted to just get further clarification because I found the portion from last week. You said you wanted to see this.
This quickly.
It's very bold and straight to the point.
Yeah, and it's one paragraph out of 100 paragraphs of law on the subject. So yes,
it doesn't talk about law in this book.
Sorry, these are all quotations from law sources. All of the things in this paragraph are quotations from a Mishnah in Ksubas. So don't try to change the subject and say it's philosophy, it's not law. He has lots of legal statements in the book, but here he's telling you that if one wants to move to Eretz Yisrael and the other doesn't, and there are no other factors that are legally relevant to be considered, then the one who wants can force the other one to go, otherwise the other one has a penalty. And the same thing is true with leaving Eretz Yisrael. If it's legally appropriate to leave the land of Israel and one doesn't want to leave, then you can force him, or if he faces... But there are also, in the Mishnah talks about, and the Gemara talks about when you're allowed to leave the land and when you're not allowed to leave the land. So you're taking one paragraph out of a subject that has 100 paragraphs of law. So that just means you can't read something in isolation.
So then, where did the Mishnayos, where did they come to the thinking that you're able, it's appropriate for you to leave leave the land?
Yes, but there are three reasons for which you should leave the land. One is to get married, one is to earn a living, and one is to learn Torah. And they're brought in the Gemara, and they're codified in the Shulchan Aruch, And then each one of those has to be quantified. How much? Well, how much is the difference? How much is the difference in the money that you could make, and so forth and so on. Right? And this is all done in the Shulchan Aruch.
So when it says it's better to live in a city that's in Israel that's mostly non-Jewish versus living outside of Israel in a city that's mostly Jewish, it's better to live.
Yeah, see, it isn't where you quoted it. You said that there are no Jews in the land of Israel.
I know, I said it wrong.
Yeah,
but
you see that but look where your logic has to come from. I said to you, if there's no minyan, it's not possible to learn Torah, it's not possible to do mitzvos, it can't be right, and it isn't right. It just means that there are few. There are fewer Jews here. There's a larger and more better developed Jewish community outside the land of Israel. So then the question will be, can you learn Torah as well in this smaller city in Israel than outside? If not, then it's right to leave. I mean, you can't take what's written on one page when the subject has a lot of material to it and understand it. You just can't.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So when we enjoy food on Shabbos, we call that Oneg Shabbos. Can you help clarify the distinction between taking pleasure in Shabbos versus taking pleasure in food on Shabbos? And to generalize the question, what is the difference between enjoying Shabbos versus enjoying the various niceties that occur on Shabbos? Is there such a thing as Oneg Shabbos, or the pleasure of Shabbos that exists as an independent reality above and beyond the group of physical pleasures that are associated with Shabbos?
Yeah, okay, so I keep forgetting to repeat the question. It was a good question. Let me just say it over. You're talking about enjoying Shabbos in relationship to Oneg Shabbos. And as you're quite right, Oneg Shabbos refers to things that are physically pleasurable. And then the question is whether there's such a thing as somehow enjoying Shabbos above and beyond the individual physical pleasures that are programmed into the context of the day. And I think part of your question was, what's the difference between enjoying food on Shabbos, which is called Oneg Shabbos, which is a mitzvah, and enjoying the food during the week, which isn't called a mitzvah in that way? How does the enjoyment of the food change its character? So, let me give you, first of all, an analogy to think about. I want you to imagine two meals. One is a meal that you made for yourself at home, when you happen to be home alone. And the other meal is where the king has come to your town and is having a celebration, and you and, let's say, 25 other selected people have been invited to join in the celebration, and the menu for the two meals is exactly the same. And the food is spoiled. Not unhealthy, but it's just, poorly done. Poorly done. How much does the poor state of the food damage the event or the experience? I think the difference is gigantic. If you made supper at home for yourself, and that's the meal that you're going to eat, and now you're stuck with this stuff, it's going to be awful. You'll manage it, but it's going to be awful. If you're sitting there with the king, and you've been invited with 25 other people out of, let's say, 10,000, you've been honored, and the evening is discussing matters of state, and they're interested in your opinion. And as this is going on, they're serving you this dish, and this dish, and this dish, and the cook just doesn't have it, It will have a very, very minor effect on the quality of the experience. In the case of the repast with the king, the good taste of the food contributes to an otherwise very meaningful and very inspiring and very enjoyable event. It accompanies it. It's part of the celebration of the event. In the other case, the food is the whole thing. It's just food. And if the food is spoiled, then it's awful. The whole experience of eating supper becomes a sour experience, a rotten experience. So The idea is that you're sitting down at a Shabbos meal and you're doing so in celebration of something. I don't know, I really haven't done a study of how people eat Shabbos meals. I learned from my Rabbi Zatzal, and most of us follow in his footsteps. Each Shabbos meal takes 2.5 hours. Each Shabbos meal takes 2.5 hours. Usually a 6-course dinner. And there's singing and there's discourse and Torah, sharing throughout. And it's an event. It's a real event. Of course, the soup is the soup and the chicken is the chicken and the potatoes are the potatoes. So enjoying the food under the condition where the whole tenor is this elevated event is an entirely different kind of enjoyment than when it's Wednesday night and you're making supper for yourself at home. So yes, there's a difference between enjoying the food in the context of Shabbos versus enjoying the food, same food, in the context of being at home alone for a weekday supper. That's one part of the answer. Another part of the answer is this, and now we need an introduction of a different term. There's Oneg on Shabbos and there's Simcha on Shabbos. Oneg has a physical connotation. Oneg Shabbos is the meals, basically. Simcha is joy. Joy can have physical components and can be divorced from physical components. I guess it depends a little bit on how you define physical, but the joy of great music, or the joy of a great idea, or the joy of coming to finally understand a piece of Torah which connects you to your Creator through the ways that He revealed for that purpose, they're all exciting and they're all thrilling and they're all inspiring, but in different ways. Shabbos has an element of simcha. This is actually a verse in the Torah as the oral tradition interprets it. And usually, beyond saying the oral tradition interprets it, it's really pretty clear in the verse itself. I think I've told you this, that there's an instruction to make trumpets, silver trumpets. And the Torah tells you when to blow them. And it says, B'yom simchaschem, u'v'moadechem, u'roshei chodshechem. So it means on the days of your joy, your simcha, and on your holidays, and on the beginnings of your months. So now, let's see, what could that be? There's Q, holidays, and the beginning of the month. Well, the beginning of the month is below holidays, so it looks like it's a decreasing list. Now, what is there that could be above holidays? The only thing left above holidays is Shabbos. So that's the way the Chazal understand it. Yom Simchaschem means on Shabbosos. And that means Shabbos is being described in the Torah as the day of Simcha. So the time has that quality of Simcha. Now you ask, well, where does the Simcha come from? Simcha comes from the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu manifests Himself at that time in ways that He doesn't manifest Himself at other times. And you say, well, He never tapped me on the shoulder, I never saw it, I never heard it. That's true. If you close your eyes, you won't see something. If you're colorblind, you won't see colors. If you're very distracted, you won't see what's in front of you. You do have to focus. You do have to perceive. You do have to be receptive. That you do have to do. If you don't get that, it'll pass you right by. But it is there. So the joy is in the connection with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the meals are part of celebrating that connection. And it's done in a particular way so as to express those things. If you look at the songs we sing, many of the songs were composed by Rishonim, that means medieval, great authorities, great Torah scholars, great tzaddikim, and they composed this. I'm calling it poetry is a little not quite right, because the Western concept of poetry on the one hand and what we have is literally different, but I'm not going to go into that now. It's words that express and describe certain aspects of Jewish experience, and when you sing them to the tunes that express their content, their feeling, it becomes a very spiritual experience. And
I was listening to a really interesting debate between these two prominent Chabad rabbis. They're discussing which is of more importance, which is in a Jew's avodas Hashem. Is it their positive mitzvahs that they observe, or is it the negative mitzvahs that they don't do? And I heard like both positions, and in the debate. So the one side, I would like to hear the Rav's position on this, which is greater importance, or if they're equal. But like they quoted they didn't quote in this debate, but I saw a Gemara, or I heard in a shir Gemara, I think it's in Cedar, that they're discussing what would have been better if man wasn't created. I think it's in the Gemara, and they said because there's 365 negative mitzvahs, there's more things Hashem doesn't want you to do than to do. Thereby would have been better if Hashem didn't create man, because there's 365 things he shouldn't do, there's negative mitzvahs, and there's 248 positive. So I can't really quote, I forgot which Gemara it is, because there's a lot more negative than positive. Rabbi, so the one rabbi in the position of the negative is could be greater than positive, is because like in Tehilim, Dovid HaMelech says, "Sum merav aseh tov." You first have to stop doing bad, and then pursue the good. And you don't really see that in Curve today. It's usually like aseh tov, and then like trying to get people to do mitzvahs, and then when they've built more of a connection to Yiddishkeit, then they learn about the sumera. You know, like go around. Like we can see in society, people go around telling people not to do things. It doesn't really go. People that aren't connected to Yiddishkeit, they don't really listen. I don't know, but I would like to hear the Rav's position on which is greater, and why in the Torah that we have more negative mitzvahs than positive, if Hashem created us, I don't know, to do things.
I'm totally innocent of this entire subject. The first time in my life I heard of anyone considering which is more important, the positive commandments or the negative importance. I never heard of anyone considering that.
Which is
I
greater?
Wouldn't, greater in size, in weight, and what they'll bring in currency when you do it on the open market. What would greater mean here?
More important.
Yeah, well, more important. Right, more important. That's very clear. I know ways to measure importance, but there's not going to be any hierarchy between positive and negative. Let's take, for example, penalties. Right? So some negative commandments have greater penalties than some positive, and some positive commandments have greater penalties than negative commandments. So if to say in as a whole, the whole group Well, how would you weigh it up? How many points would you give to each one? So, I mean, I don't hear that this. I don't hear that there's a well-defined question at all. Number one. Yeah. Number two, where you start is surely not the right criterion. You very, very rarely start with the most important thing you want to accomplish. When you're training for sports, you start with exercises. You're not going to compete doing exercises. You're going to compete playing football. If you don't do exercise, you won't be strong enough to play football. So you start with the least important thing, not the most important thing. You start with the least important thing. You start with what's necessary to be able to do the most important thing. So just what you start with is surely not a criterion. The number of them? So then the other 603 commandments are much more important than the 10 commandments, because there's 603 of them, and only 10 of these. So there might be more of them. Surely that's not the right way to calculate importance, right? I mean, and by the way, it's not 10 commandments, it's 14 commandments, it's 10 sayings. I mean, the criteria that are being used,
it says in the Gemara why.
It says nothing of the kind. It says nothing of the kind. The Gemara you're quoting is the Gemara in Erevin. There's a machlokes based on Shammai. Whether Noach la'adam nivra or lo Noach la'adam nivra, whether now Noach is one of these very flexible words. It can be pleasant, successful, happy, valid, appropriate, and so forth and so on. You could put it in very vague general terms. Was the creation of man a success or not a success? Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai took two different opinions, and they debated for 2.5 years, and then they came to a conclusion that it was better for man not to have been created. But that has nothing to do with the relative value of positive and negative commandments. Both can be violated. And when they're violated, the person's not living up to the purposes for which he's been created. What will we say? Since if he wasn't created, he wouldn't have violated any of the 365. And if he is created, then he may or may not do the 248. So therefore, it's better not to be created. The negative ones are only important for someone who lives and doesn't violate them. Not important to show the superiority of not being created. Not relevant. It's just not relevant. Furthermore, as the commentaries point out, and like Gemara and Erevin, the discussion whether the creation of man was a success or not, it seems to me that the Creator himself testifies. It says, at the end of the 6 days of creation, Shem saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. I think we can take the Creator at his word. If everything was very good, man also has to be very good. So it can't be that it wasn't right, appropriate, valid, that he should be created. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter understands the Gemara this way. The question the Gemara was asking was, can we see why the creation of man was a success or not? Of course it was a success. The Creator says it was a success. End of story. But can we see it? And the difference, says Rav Dessler, being a Baal Musar, is this. If we can see how man's creation is a success, then we can guide ourselves by trying to become more and more part of that success. We can try to improve ourselves in the direction of that which is ideal. But if we can't see what is how man's creation is success, then we have to guide ourselves the opposite way. We at least know what failure is. We know what things are failures. We have to guide ourselves by avoiding the failures, strengthening ourselves against the failures, because we can't appreciate what the success is. So he took it in a Musar sense, how do you guide your actual development? But making an overall judgment as to which is somehow more valuable or more important, the positives or the positives and negatives. The Ramban says that the positive commandments express love of God, and the negative commandments express fear and or awe of God. And love is a higher correction than awe and fear. That's an argument which applies to all of them, because it's the quality that they all have, and in this one aspect, the positives would come out superior to the negatives. So you mentioned that. So now I didn't see this debate by the Rabbi. I find the debate. They
brought an example of like Rosh Hashanah falling out on Shabbos, and how we don't do a mitzvah d'oraisa of blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, because it's on Shabbos, because the rabbis were concerned that people are going to be will be taking the shofar out of an Erev, or like they'd be transgressing Shabbos to blow the shofar, which is like a mitzvah. It's like a darabanan. It overrides because this idea of sheval taseh. Rather sit and do nothing than do something.
Yeah, that's right. But now let's just see whether the right analysis is because this one's positive and this one's negative, so all the negative ones are more important than all the positive ones. Or maybe, let's see, Shabbos is one of the 10 pronouncements at Sinai. Shabbos is mentioned something like 15 times in the Torah. The penalty for violating Shabbos is death. Whereas shofar is just one of the positive commandments with no special penalty and no special distinction. Wouldn't it be more reasonable to say it's Shabbos versus shofar, not some negative versus some positive, and generalize it to all the rest? I really think that's a very, very weak argument to say that because this negative overrides this positive, all negatives are more important than all positives. I think there's no logic there. I think there's no logic there. As I said, now I may be just ignorant of this. The literature that I have seen on mitzvos never raised this question, which is more superior to Muslim, and certainly by the number of them. And to me, it's bizarre. I can't. I would have to see it inside to be able to appreciate it. Yeah.
There's an interesting thing that the Rabbi just mentioned. I just reading in the Chumash. It says on Shabbos, one who observes Shabbos, the desecrator is put to death, and one who does work, he suffers kares. What's the difference?
I don't know. What are you reading there?
The Chumash. It says one who desecrates it.
Yes.
I read in Hebrew. It says ki.
Mechalaleha mosumos.
Yeah. V'nichasha nefesh ahi mikerev b'malacha. But it's talking about for somebody who keeps Shabbos and who mechalels it dies.
What's that? Keeps it and is mechalel it? How much do you mean?
Sorry, one who you should keep Shabbos.
Yes.
Because it's holy, and one who mechalels it dies.
Right.
And everything that you do, malacha, if you do malacha on it, you're cut off. What's the difference between doing mechalel and doing malacha?
No, so mechalel and mechalel is the same thing, but you only die if there are witnesses, and you're warned before you do it, and you accept the warning and say, I know I'm doing it anyway. Only then does the person die. If any of those conditions is not met, then he gets kares. Kares is a heavenly punishment. Death means death by the Sanhedrin, death by an earthly court. So that's what it's referring to. But in both cases, chilul Shabbos means doing malacha on Shabbos. There is no other definition of chilul Shabbos. Nothing else that violates Shabbos. So it's not two different performances. It's the performance under two different conditions. Yeah.
How can one connect to Tehilim and like know which psalms to say and use them for prayer or whatever, or what can they be used for?
So I'll tell you, I was misled about this for years. I sort of alluded to this before. I thought that, say, Psalms, Tehilim, is like Jewish poetry, Torah poetry. But I think that poetry in the Western tradition has a very different purpose from the purpose that Tehilim has. Poetry in the Western tradition is meant to evoke certain thoughts and certain feelings. It's meant to stimulate certain thoughts and certain feelings. You go to a poetry reading, someone reads the poetry, that causes you to feel certain emotions and have certain ideas. I tried using Tehilim that way, and I found, for me anyway, it didn't do anything. But I realized after years that the Tehilim's job is when you're already in a certain position, you're already experiencing something. It gives you the words to express it. And it gives you the words to express it and describe it in the appropriate way. Now here, I'm going to quote psychologists, Some of you know me that I'm very cautious about giving an imprimatur to psychology. But there is something called framing, which they use in cognitive psychology, where something happens to you and it has an effect on you. To a large extent, the effect that the event has depends upon how you frame it. And your framing there can be a number of different frames, all of which are realistic. It's not a question of fooling yourself, or hypnotizing yourself, or creating a hallucination, but rather selecting the elements in the event which you are going to focus on and use as the basis for your reaction. That's also not something you can just snap your fingers and do, but at least gives you a picture of the project. So, for example, when there were something called postcards, which you can read about in your ancient history book, and they had pictures on them, some of them were painted by people who were quadriplegics. They had lost the use of their arms and their feet, some kind of paralysis, but they could move their toes. And they learned to paint pictures with their toes. Paintbrushes in between their toes, they painted pictures. So they used to put this on, you should buy the postcard because some of the money went to them, supported them. But now, when a person becomes a quadriplegic, there are two paths in front of you. I'm dead. I'm dead. 92% of all the things that I used to do, I can't do. My life is over. It's all finished. And they can die of depression. It's true. 92% is gone. That's true. That's the truth. It's also true that 8% is left. They're both true. These people will paint pictures and say, okay, so what's left? Toes. Okay, what can I do with my toes? Let me find out. What do other people do when they're in my position? Finds out that you can paint. And he thinks, okay, that's something I can do. And then he lives, and he's creative. I remember another guy who learned to program on the computer with his toes, and he became a weather forecaster. He examined the satellite pictures, and he was able to forecast the weather. So, here it's a matter of taking what's happening to you and framing it. That's something which Tehilim can do. Dovid Melech and the other authors, by the way, King David did not write all of Tehilim. There were 10 authors, of whom he was one. He was also the editor. But many written by other people. Some of the Tehilim cry out in anguish over terrible suffering, terrible loss. Okay? People have losses. People have losses. How do you frame it? The Tehilim can teach you how to frame it. And that can give you a quality of experience which enables you to deal with it in a positive, creative way. I learned this from Rabbi Puskin, I think his first book was called Gateway to Happiness. It's a very good book, in my estimation. It's really cognitive therapy, but with many, many Torah sources that support and develop the idea. So if you look at Tehilim that way, as framing the experiences that you're having, then I think it can be very useful. And if you understand the Hebrew, which is quite hard, some of it's poetical and quite difficult, but if you invest in studying it, by the way, if you're interested in Tehilim, I would say the one book to get is Rabbi Hirsch's commentary. There's a whole book commentary on Tehilim. 145th Psalm, which we call Ashrei I, that's an extra edition, that bothered me for many years. Some of you know I taught it to you. Because to me it was a jumble, just a jumble of one thing after another, no particular order or organization. And he makes order and organization out of it in an astonishing way. Just for that alone, it's worth going through and just, because you say Ashrei 3 times a day. And then I know I'm a Cedar person. I think to be organized and analyzed and structured and things developed, and it was just a jumble. So I think that if you think of it that way, as framing what's already going on, giving you a way to frame it and relate to it, and rather than something which is going to create the feelings in you, that may help make a bridge for me. Yeah.
Is it true that if you say Asher kavana, you have to repeat it? Like, what does that mean? Like,
no, it means that you have the whole section called Psukei Zimra. Not every part of it is equally important. Ashrei is the most central part of it. By the way, if you're short of time, what you do is say Baruch Shemar Ashrei Yishtaba, and you're satisfied. But that's the one thing you should say. You should say Ashrei, not the other thing. Say that. And of Ashrei, the one pasuk, Posei Avedidecha, is the most important pasuk. And your helpful, friendly article Cedar, it says right there next to Posei Avedidecha, have special attention to this verse when you are saying this, and they're right. Yeah?
Can you elaborate on the topic about how God, who is a total unity, can be manifested in disparate parts?
God was a total what?
Total unity. There's no parts in God.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Let me tell you what the Rambam says about a similar question. You have something, Q, and you know that when Q interacts with this type of thing, it makes them harder, and when it interacts with that type of thing, it makes them softer, and that type of thing, it makes them black, and then that type of thing makes them white, and your natural thought is, well, this Q has in it some glue that makes things hard, and it has in it some acid that makes things soft, and it has some white paint, and it makes it white and black, and so forth and so on. And the Rambam says no. You could have one thing that has different effects on the things that it interacts with, but the thing that's the cause has one quality only, and that's, for example, fire. Fire softens and melts metal, but hardens protein. Hardens eggs. Fire burns up wood and creates ash, which can be white, or fire can blacken the face of a rock, and the rock becomes black. Fire is fire. It's the difference in the things that the fire applies to that determines the effects. So, we don't say literally that God is in different places. Now, I know this is very difficult because you said, God is here, God is there, God is everywhere. You know that when you're 6, and so on and so on. So let me share with you a frustration I have with a certain mental set that I come across very often. And that is, in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, God is described in anthropomorphic terms a lot. At least 75 times, maybe hundreds of times. God has eyes and ears and shoulders and legs, nostrils, mouth. Rabbi, that's not a problem. That's not a problem. We know that. We know that this is poetry. We know it means to talk about his abilities and powers and so on and so on. We know it's not meant literally. Okay, good. I'm glad you got that. That's correct. But when it comes to rabbinic writings, oh no, Rabbi. Rabbinic writings have to be taken like a 6-year-old, word for word, what it says in the dictionary, no imagination and no straying from the... Why, boys and girls, why? Couldn't the rabbis have copied the style of the Tanakh? So it says, the human soul is a piece of God on high. That's gotta mean that God is a savant, and his slices of God, so that each person can have a slice. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. God is everywhere. To be in a physical place, you have to be a physical thing. Period. You can't be in a place unless you're a physical thing. And if you tell me, yeah, Rabbi, but you're talking about things, I'm talking about God. When you talk about God, all bets are off, anything can happen. What you're really telling me is, when I talk about God, my words don't have to make sense. I say, if you've decided not to take responsibility that your words should make sense, just stop talking. Just stop talking. Don't talk, and then when you get into trouble, say, well, I didn't really mean it, because I'm talking about God, so it doesn't have to make sense. Then don't talk. If it's really beyond understanding, beyond logic, then don't talk. Just keep quiet. God revealed these things to us so they should be understood. So you say when it says that God is everywhere, and in the Zohar, it says, no place is empty of him. Can't we trust the Zohar? Sure, you can trust the Zohar as much as you can trust the prophet Isaiah, and the prophet Yechezkel, and Sefer Daniel. You can trust him to say something which, when understood correctly, is true. But you don't trust him that every 6-year-old can understand him, especially the Zohar. It wasn't written for 6-year-olds. So the rough understanding of there's no place empty of God is this, that God's will gives existence to everything that exists. Nothing is disconnected from God. Because if we're disconnected, it couldn't exist. But the connection is that God's will is giving it existence, not that God is in the table. Because God isn't a physical object. So saying that he is everywhere just means that the effect of his will is felt everywhere. Doesn't mean that he personally is there. So that's this. I'm just very much frustration of people who say when it comes to the Tanakh and anthropomorphism, sure it's poetry and we know it means something else. But what is the Zohar? The Zohar. No, that's got to be for 6-year-olds. It's got to be just what it says and what's written. Can't change it in any way, shape, or form. Or a midrash, or a statement in the Talmud. Actually, nobody's whatsoever to say that. Yeah.
So, I'm from Cape Town, and it's a very old Jewish community that could be like 170 years. And there's a cemetery.
I laugh. Very old.
Well, okay, it's old, so like it's
you speak like an American. You know, in America, a house is 100 years old is an antique, right?
Okay, it's all
We go back 3,300 years.
Okay.
170 years is yesterday. It's a half hour ago. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, okay.
I've been to Cape
So
Town
we
several
have a
times.
very young community.
I've been to Cape Town several times, and I
So, have you seen, there's a Jewish cemetery there, and like I have family like 3 generations back in that cemetery, and there's this part of the cemetery where there's graves like far away from everywhere else in the cemetery, and I asked like why is it separate from the rest, and I think when the Rabbi told me that like 100 years ago they used to bury people that committed suicide away from everyone else, and like I was pretty shocked that like we don't do that today. Like today there's much more sensitivity, I feel like, towards like suicides because mental health, or I just like we don't bury people that commit suicide separately, or like because the Torah it says like punishment is death, or kill himself. I don't know, maybe that's death in heaven, Misvei Shemayim. Why is suicide? Why is it treated much more sensitively nowadays than before?
I don't know if it would be, and I think it depends to a certain. I'm not expert in the subject, so I can just say the couple of things that I have heard. I do know that there is a feeling, it depends on how the person died. In particular, whether the process of death took time. Let's say hanging. A person can commit suicide by hanging himself. Since that takes several minutes, there's a presumption that before he died, he regretted. Changed his mind and he regretted. That would be a reason to bury him together with other people. I want you to know, suicide is murder. It's murder. And God says don't commit murder, that includes suicide. And people say, it's my life and I can decide if I want to live, I don't want to live, so on. Leave that for Los Angeles, it has nothing to do with us. Suicide is murder. That means this person, would it surprise you if you found out that people who cold-bloodedly killed someone else, buried separately, that wouldn't surprise you. That's murder. Well, this is murder.
They kill themselves.
So, killing yourself is murder. That's murder. Right? You are a person, you're alive, and God said, don't end anyone's life, including your own. So if you end your own life, it's murder. So I think we don't appreciate the severity of suicide, and we don't appreciate the importance of burial. I mean, who are we forgiving? Who are we who are we being sensitive to? You know, the person's neshama, he's getting what he's getting in the next world, no matter what happens to his body. Right? But what about example for everybody else? Is he to be treated equally with everybody else? If then you communicate that, well, you know, committing suicide like having a cheeseburger. There's just something wrong. And people do things that are wrong, and then you bury them and you put up a tombstone like everybody else, and so on and so on. You may not want to give that impression. So I don't know all the details, but I think that people don't appreciate the seriousness of suicide.
What about the ideas oinus, like mental health? I heard a lot of there's like a person that kills himself because of depression or mental health issues. That's not considered like, I hear a lot of rabbis saying it's oinus. That's out of his control.
I guess it depends upon the details of the case. If you go the whole way with the modern perversions, it says in French, to know all is to forgive all. Forgive. Because if you know the person psychologically well enough, you know what he did, you'll see that he's not responsible for what he did. It was his childhood, it was his teacher in school, it was the fact that he had a disease that he overcame. Yeah, that's why he did what he did. And that means no one is ever responsible for anything. Well, that's a teaching we can't accept. Sorry. We don't believe that that's correct. So there are pressures and there are difficulties. Some choices are harder than other choices. Some people are less responsible for what they do because it's much harder for them to do the right thing. Our sources do say that. But to simply say that you call it mental illness and therefore there's no responsibility is much too glib and much too broad brush. It has to be taken apart in very, very delicate terms. Specifically about suicide, I don't know. I don't know the burial practices. Burial practices, I think, to great
Today they've stopped it though.
are a matter of custom. So I don't know who governs the custom, how it's organized, but what the sources are. I never studied it. Okay, gentlemen.